All right, welcome everybody to another kind of podcast thingamajig. I don't know why I just don't call it a podcast, but anyway, it is going to be the normal crew. I am Nick.
Mike.
And Travis.
And our topic today is going to be on AAA versus indie games. And for those of you who know me, I'm not a huge fan of AAA games, but don't worry, this podcast is not to shit on AAA games. It is most likely going to be talking about how basically the breakdown about what makes the indie game versus what makes it a AAA game, and how they're kind of answering the call of what gamers want as well. But to start it off, I was going to say, if we're going to distinguish the two, it's a really important thing to note on basically the money that it costs for one of them, the quality, the length, and the amount. So to start things off, let's focus on the quality and the length of the game. I guess not quality and length, but let's start with the like amount of games that are out there for it. And so in my mind, one of the big things that distinguishes them, at least from what I've seen, is that there's been so many indie games that have been made, but AAA games kind of match it with more content, I guess. So AAA games have less games, but more content, but indie games have more, but you might not play them as long. So starting off on there, who wants to go?
I'll let Travis go first.
Okay.
Go, Travis.
So we're just talking about content versus quality.
Well, we're just first going to talk about the amount, and so what distinguishes the two first. So, what do you think about the whole thing? Like, which one do you think would be more fit to your style? Would you rather want a game with more content and not play as many games, or would you rather have a lot of different games and play a lot more different and see a lot more stories, I guess?
I guess it depends on how involved I am in the story. Because, like, if I'm really invested in the story, obviously I would like it to actually have a lot more content because, you know, I want to, like, see how it progresses. Whereas if it's, you know, short, then it's like, aw, I wish there was more. But, I typically, as of lately, have been absolutely awful at finishing any game I've started. So I'm kind of more into the indie where it's a lot more games, but like a lot less story, just because I literally have started playing a game and then stopped and then started playing another game. Because I have probably a list of over 10 games that I've started now that I'm trying to complete.
Oh, damn. Sounds like Mike, honestly.
It's terrible.
Yeah, it is.
So, yeah, so in that regard, probably more games but less content, just so I can actually finish games and move on with my life instead of feeling bad about having all of these things to do, no time to do them.
And I feel like that's one of the reasons why indie is actually doing very well on there, because so many people want to try to get a nice experience and say that they have a couple of games that they can beat rather than just playing one game for a very long time. I guess it's one of the things you kind of look for in a game. So, Mike, what do you think?
If I have to answer the question, I guess I would say less games, more content, just because I prefer games that typically like have a lot more depth to it, where like, oh, I can explore this one area for like 5-6 hours and find tons of cool new secrets and stuff. I'm just glad I don't have to make the choice, because I can turn on a game where I can do one, and then I can turn on a game where I do the other. Because for me, the way I've always done it is I just make indie games my side games. So like lately I've been playing through Final Fantasy VII again, and I'm about 30 hours into that game. But in the meantime, I've beaten like 2 or 3 indie games. I've replayed through Super Meat Boy. I beat the game Celeste, and I've played a couple other indie games too. So those have always been kind of the games that I play on the side, because typically indie games are a lot shorter. So they kind of complement each other in that sense. So I guess I don't think one style necessarily like works better than the other. I guess it depends on time schedule, like Travis said. Sometimes with AAA games, you play one and then you end up playing it for like 3 weeks, and then another one comes out, so you start playing that one, and then they sort of stack onto each other. Like for me, I bought Monster Hunter World, and I'm still like maybe 2 hours into that game. So I'm in the middle of that game, in the middle of Final Fantasy VII. I started Dissidia Final Fantasy.
Well, does Monster Hunter really ever end, though? That's the question.
That game does have a story that does technically end, I guess.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Pokemon, where there's an ending.
Yeah, I feel like it's more of the fun of the game is just roaming around hunting monsters, though. Like, it's not like a game that's really set to, you beat the story and then you stop playing. I don't think that's the point of it. I think the point is to go on hunts with your friends.
Yeah, in my head, though, I always say, like, I'm going to stop playing this game as soon as I beat the story, you know? That's like where I say that's when I can move on from a game. I'll always, like, revisit something, I guess. But that's how I sort of decide when I'm done with something. But a game like Monster Hunter World, even if you're just doing the story, it's still super long, and it's like you said, with the friend stuff, it goes on forever. So AAA games like that, those games are hard to play like 2 or 3 at the same time, because it's pretty much impossible. So,
Yeah.
I feel like these two types of games complement each other.
Yeah, which is actually a good way to transition into the next point on how they kind of differ, and it's going to be on the quality and the length of the game itself. And in my mind, again, we talk about it because obviously there's definitely a huge switch to, or a huge push into this new powerful new graphics and whatnot. And so you see these AAA games, and they really want to make sure that they look beautiful. And one of the ways that indie decides that, okay, we're not going to compete with making 4K resolution. We're going to compete with a unique art style most of the time. Sometimes AAA will like blend an art style in with the really amazing lifelike graphics, but at the same time, if you're talking about, again, as we were talking about before, AAA games usually have a lot more depth, while indie games are more likely short, sweet, to the point. I mean, I know indie games can last for a decently long time, but in comparison, AAA games probably last like 3 to 4 times as long on average in my mind. Because the amount of stuff that is actually packed in those games is amazing. And so I think one of the things that it really speaks to is the kind of playstyle as well. I mean, time also factors in, but the playstyle as well. If you want to actually play a game and get really, again, immersed in the world and everything, you can do that. Or if you just want to have, like what you were saying before, just a little kind of side experience as you're playing a bigger game, I think that works as well. And it kind of breaks up the monotony if you play a lot of that game and you're like, I want to experience something different just for a short amount of time. Because I think, Mike, you said Hellblade wasn't a very long game, right? Like 10 hours, right?
Yeah, no, Hellblade, I think I beat it probably in about like 7-8 hours. So that one's very short.
So yeah, that's what I was saying. So if we're talking about it, I think quality is one of the things that you could definitely look at in a couple different ways. And so I kind of want to hear what Travis has to say about this, because in my mind, at least in my mind, I just look at it because I haven't really ever been involved in like gotten into the genre when it comes to like shooter games, but the quality of them kind of looks very similar. But I'm sure Travis can tell me that I'm way off on that, especially when it comes down to like some of the Call of Duty games that comes out like there. But quality can be measured in a couple different ways. But if we're talking about like depth of content, it's kind of obvious to show that indie doesn't usually have a ton of content, while AAA usually has a lot more. Whether it comes in the version of DLC or actual like story content is a different discussion that I want to bring in after this. So, you guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think indie games are sort of different than AAA games in terms of how they can captivate people, simply because they have a lot less money to work with. I mean, the reality is an indie game can't do what Elder Scrolls can do, or Call of Duty, in terms of like these state-of-the-art graphics that captivate you and feel like you're actually in the world, This hyper-realism is something that's pretty much impossible to do with an indie developer. So I feel like they have to be different, and that's why I feel like this whole idea of, something that can captivate you, and something that envelops you in the game, it's all subjective, It depends on your own experience. And with indie games, and one of the games I'd like to point to, Nick, this is something that I know you've played a lot and beaten, is Celeste. Because Celeste is an absolutely beautiful game. Are the graphics realistic and state-of-the-art? No.
Or art style.
Is this some 20-hour-long story that, is going to bring you to tears? No. But it has this unique flair to it, this vibe that sort of captures you and keeps you playing. It's a story that you fall in love with and characters that you fall in love with. And it does it with a smaller budget. And that's why I feel like, it's subjective. Indie games are just going to do this differently than other games.
Which we're going to be doing a lot more about Celeste, don't worry. But I'm with you for sure. Like, when it comes down to like the quality of the game, it's kind of subjective when we talk about it. Because in my mind, I feel like that has a lot more depth in my mind, where you're able to work with a lot less and get a lot more out of it. But if I see a game, I guess, what's one that came out? Like when it comes down to something like, I don't know, Overwatch, I kind of expect those graphics, and I kind of expect that kind of gameplay or whatnot. My expectations are usually blown away more by indie games, because they seem like they kind of play with that expectation too. They're not bad at making games, they just know you're going to expect a lot less money going into it, maybe a lot less of a production cost, but we're still going to blow you away because we know that we can. I feel like the mindset that you go into these games too is you expect these things out of AAA games, because again, we're going to be talking about it more later on, but Dynasty Warriors 9, you expected that to be crazy good graphically, and they said like it could barely beat PS2 graphics or something like that when it came out.
Right.
And I feel like that's a huge issue for AAA games. I don't think it'd be a really big issue for indie game developers though.
No, it wouldn't. No. I'll let Travis go.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, because like we were saying that the AAA just has so much more funding to back it up, so then you have like all these expectations for better graphics, etc., etc. And then like what you were saying, for indies, in order to be able to still compete with these AAA graphics, they just have to get a lot more creative with either their storytelling and or the art style. Because like I know Shovel Knight, I have yet to really beat it. Like I think I played a little bit of like the first level, and then got distracted doing all of our other shenanigans that we do on this channel. So
yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah. So like I love like that art style of it's like old school retro, you know, but like and then for example, like Breath of the Wild, like obviously it's gorgeous, but it's not like realistic looking in terms of like, wow, Link looks so real versus the like Until Dawn graphics where it's like they actually hired actors and then like mimicked them exactly. But so like I'm like, Breath of the Wild looks so cool, and then Cody was just like, I don't know, it just doesn't look like it's that great of graphics. So
I'm gonna punch Cody in his freaking face then.
Exactly. So it's just like, I personally don't care about how HD and how realistic it looks, as long as it like, because like Breath of the Wild still looked really good, even though it was definitely a lot more artsy and like imaginative for it, or rather than like the AAA standards of like it just has to look as real as possible, otherwise it's not good enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Breath of the Wild also took a lot more time too.
Oh, of course, like exactly. Like I'm not saying that is like indie, you know, in that realm, but I'm just saying like in that aspect, like a lot of people who love the AAA and like the realism part of it just can't quite bring themselves to appreciate like games that don't look super real just because they have like this molded standard that they have for all the games, whereas we grew up on like the Nintendo 64. We don't give a shit how bad graphics are as long as the story's good.
Nope, that's very, very true. When I was visiting my cousin one time, I remember I had my N64 with me. No idea why I had it with me at that time, but so we were playing. I think I told you about it. And honestly, I think it's just like a generational gap thing. So he was used to playing Mario Kart for the Wii, so he's used to doing all the tilt controls. Mm-hmm. And so I was just like, hey Daniel, you want to try out one of these older ones? And so I gave him gave him a controller and put in Mario Kart 64. And seeing him try to figure out that style of game, it just never clicked. And he kept trying to tilt the N64 controller, trying to move the person, and his person just kept crashing into walls. Like, he didn't know what to do. And eventually, like, his dad had to finish up the game because his dad grew up on, like, the Atari systems and whatnot. It's just, it really depends on what kind of, like, I guess also there's a lot of factors that weigh into it, of course, but the people who are playing the game that definitely matter as well. In our mind, I feel like indie games are more advertised to us because we still love that style of graphics. Mm-hmm.
It still brings the nostalgic factor to it without actually being nostalgic because it's obviously a new story.
Yeah, well, I think nostalgia might be part of it, but I think it's more just the fact that like those are like basically that's what our preconceived notion of what games we started with and what we saw, and indie games are able to mimic that very well. There hasn't been a lot of AAA games that have really tried to do that, but I will say Dragon Quest XI coming out for the Nintendo 3DS is going to be doing something similar. I'm not sure if you heard about this, Mike, but it is a super, super cool concept. So as of the time that we're making this podcast, Dragon Quest XI has already been released in Japan for PS4, and it's going to be coming out for the Nintendo Switch and Nintendo 3DS. And I really want to pick it up for Nintendo 3DS because the top screen is, the normal good 3D graphics and whatnot, the story, but the bottom screen is a nod to the old like Dragon Warrior games where it's like a 16-bit story, and so you can see both of them at the exact same time. And I was like, that's awesome.
Yeah, that's
so
cool.
But that's like, and Square Enix is doing that now, and so I'm like, that's really cool that a third-party developer is doing that. And I wish that other kind of AAA games, and I guess Nintendo also made the Switch, but Nintendo also kind of did that with Odyssey. But not many companies are doing that, kind of bridging the gap that way. Because if you throw in those nods every now and then, I think it's a cool transition. But, I don't know. It might get overdone. We'll see. But I guess another point that I want to bring in if we're good here. Are we?
Uh-huh.
Yes? No? Okay. So Now, the big topic when it comes down to this is definitely the money. And it's obvious that AAA games are set to get as much money as possible, and this is where a lot of the times where it can turn into me just shitting on AAA games. But I don't want to focus on that. But at least this is the way that they kind of approach it to make money out of like actually making the games. Is so you see a decent amount of AAA companies like Ubisoft and I think Activision as well, EA. They use microtransactions and DLC, not focusing on that, but they use that to make more money, and they want to make a game where it seems like everybody is playing, and they're not really focused on maybe the experience that you're getting out of it. It seems like they're more focused on who's playing and if people are playing. And if they can actually make a game that people are playing, then I think that's what they're aiming for, if anything. Because then they'll have more incentive to spend more money. As say, other people are like, if people are playing more Overwatch games, like I don't think they would make a lot of money on the skins in Overwatch if people weren't actually playing the game. But indie breaks this trend extremely hard because there's a lot smaller of a team, a lot less of a budget, and a smaller group, and they're not going for that. They're going for that single player experience that's almost being left in the dust as these games keep being developed. And that's what I want to discuss a lot too, because whether we agree with the microtransactions that they do or not, and I think it's pretty clear where a lot of us stand on it, but if it works, they're going to keep doing it, and they're going to keep making money out of it. And another question that I have too for you guys is whether that $60 price tag needs to be there anymore. Because in my mind, I don't think it needs to be there anymore. So what do you guys think before I want to chime in on that?
I mean, I feel like it. So yeah, I don't think there needs to be I do think there needs to be a $60 price tag, or at least something around there. I guess it depends on what the game is and like the budgeting, because AAA games pretty much live and die by the sales they get. One bad game that sells under what they were expecting can like totally bankrupt a company. I read a book called Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, and I didn't finish it, but that book was kind of talking about that, how like a company will be just making a game, put a lot of money toward it, put it on the market, it doesn't sell well, and then that company's gone. They like have to fire half of their employees, and it's a train wreck. And so we like, especially when you're talking about like when you made the podcast about what makes a game successful, we like to talk about all these other things, but at the end of the day, it's just money for AAA developers. Because if it doesn't get the money, people lose jobs. Whereas indie developers don't have that problem. Indie developers, like look at Doki Doki Literature Club, which was pretty much made by 2 people. I mean, Dan Salvato pretty much did everything and had like help with like a couple things. Put out the game for free, and it doesn't matter. So like for indie developers, a game could not do so well or not make a ton of money, and they're fine. So they don't need a $60 price tag. But I feel like for most games out there, you kind of need it because the sales you get are like essential for jobs and things like that. And so AAA developers have a whole nother load of pressure. Now, again, I don't know the exact economics behind it. Like if they sold a game for less, if it would do better or worse. I don't know about that kind of stuff. But I know that like for them, the money absolutely matters. And I know tons and tons of games end up under like the budget. It's very rare that a company is going to make a game that like absolutely exceeds expectations. So I think it's tough for AAA.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was going to say from this, because I wanted to, if you're finishing your point, the reason I say that I don't think the $60 price tag is even necessary anymore, I think that there should still be a price tag, but it's got to, at least this is just my personal opinion, I feel like it should be around like $20-$25, something like that, especially when you're making games that are going to be heavily reliant on these live services coming later on. And the reason because of that is because when you see that Ubisoft makes 80% of their money off of microtransactions and like DLC in general, that means that the actual game sales don't even matter. And you're thinking, okay, well, there's a lot of production costs and that's increasing and whatnot. So that's what, and games have been stagnant at $60. I think that's straight up bullshit, because there was a game that was going to come out. I can't remember what it was called. I was watching a YouTube video on it, and it was about like kind of like the horror game. It was like a horror game. It was kind of creepy. It was where everybody had to like take a pill to become complacent. I don't remember what the game is. If I do, I'll send Mike whatever the game is later. But the game was basically, I think it might have had a Kickstarter, was going to be for $30. But then because it became a AAA title, they just boosted it to $60 because they're just like, we just wanted to match the trend. I feel like just because of the fact that the $60 price tag has been there for such a long time, that we're fine with paying it, they're going to keep charging it. Because it's simple supply and demand. They're going to charge what people are going to pay. So I don't think that $60 price tag is even necessary anymore, especially if you're going to be spending money on the live services. But the counter argument to that is the fact that, well, I don't want freemium games to happen for a console market. But honestly, where is the industry going? it's headed in that direction, like with the same thing with the mobile market. So if you make a game free to play, then I feel like you can get a lot more people playing it. But if you actually charge people up for an upfront cost, I feel like that excludes a lot other people going to play it. Because the people who are going to be spending money in those games, I feel like would be more inclined to spend money if they get the game for a cheaper price. So in my mind, if you're making 80% of your revenue off of microtransactions and DLC, you don't need that price tag there, or it should be a lot less. That's what I think.
I'll say, like, take what I say with a grain of salt, because again, I don't understand economics and like business and stuff like that. So everything I say could be totally wrong. But I feel like that idea would totally destroy games that don't do microtransactions. Because I get what you're saying for like Star Wars Battlefront. Okay, you're right. They could do the $20 thing because most of their money comes from microtransactions. But what about Final Fantasy or a game that doesn't do that? Are they just supposed to put the game out for $60? Because then they look bad because Star Wars Battlefront's out there for $20 and Final Fantasy 16, whenever that comes out, is going to be on there for $60 because they're not making money from microtransactions. And then people are going to complain saying, well, why would I pay $60 if this game over here is $20? I just feel like if we went that route, it would make it a lot harder for games that don't do microtransactions. And then at that point, you would be encouraging companies, well, just everyone do microtransactions then. So, you know, it's kind of like a double-edged sword.
I can see it. I can see it in that way. In my mind, the basically the wrench in the plan is the single player experience. It can work for these games that are like big multiplayer games, like or like have like a lot of people playing. I guess like a Warcraft thing, maybe like what's another game? Like maybe Assassin's Creed Origins, I think. But games that are large enough and that like have like a lot more content that can be provided through these ways, I feel like they don't need that money. But I'm with you. If anything, it would hurt more companies that are going for that single player experience. But a lot of companies are moving away from that. Like we loved Breath of the Wild and we loved Mario Odyssey and we loved like the experiences that we got out of them. But so many game companies, like if at least it seems to me that AAA isn't doing a lot of those single game or single player experiences as much anymore, or at least they're trending to move away from it. So, I mean, Persona 5, I feel like, is an outlier on there because of the fact that it made an amazing single-player experience. A lot of games I don't feel like are doing that anymore, at least in my mind. And indie kind of thinks, okay, well, that's dumb. If we're not going to pay for keeping crazy amount of servers online, so let's just go for that single-player experience. And so that's another thing why I'm thinking when you bring it in between indie games and AAA games, more of it is dependent on what kind of player do you want to go for. If you're there for like the social interaction or maybe because you want to play with your friends online, I feel like you might be going more of the route of AAA games just to do so. But if you're going to be playing more, if you want to be like, okay, I want to get a really good story out of this, I feel like it's more of like you want to go the path of an indie game. That's what I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
What do you think about that?
I mean, I agree. I think that's why, because most of what we just talked about was like for AAA games. And I think that's the thing is indie games don't have to worry about that stuff. So it's like you said, indie games just give you a completely different experience. You know, it's sort of being like an entrepreneur where like you sort of have the freedom to do whatever you want if you're an indie developer. Whereas like if you're this big company, you don't have that freedom. In a way, it's weird. The bigger the company, the more money you have, it's almost like the less freedom you have to do something. And I think that's why indie games tend to feel so much more, you know, carefree and lovable. You know, you talk about games like Celeste, Doki Doki Literature Club, these types of games, they feel like they're made with a lot more love because these developers don't have to worry about money as much. Any money they make is sort of just icing on the cake, but it's not necessary. Whereas for AAA games, they don't have a choice. And so, you know, I think it goes back to that point where we sort of focus on those things. It's just two different experiences. So indie games, like you said, it's more about just like the little experience you get. You sort of go through it, whereas AAA games have to be the things where you dive into content, have tons of stuff to explore. But like we said, it's two different things that totally complement each other. I think the gaming world would be horrible if we had one over the other.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it comes down to a lot of what you can do and what you should do. In my mind, at least, this is just my personal opinion, I don't think that they should have the kind of use of microtransactions that they do, like in the loot box systems. But in the same way, that's no different than Pokemon cards and baseball cards back in the day. And I loved Pokemon cards. There's nothing different about that. There's nothing different about the model. If you can't be mad at one and not be mad at the other. But at least there's just a huge inconsistency there. So I think the money thing is one of just the really big things that just divides them, and they kind of structure their game around that. So whether they should make a game about that, that's I think where a lot of people can differ. So I don't think that they should, but at the same time, they can definitely do it. and it has been working. So unless there's going to be like an actual stop or like boycott, it's not going to change anytime soon.
No.
So before we get off this money topic, I was going to say, Travis, do you have any opinions on the money? On the money between AAA and indie games?
For me, I definitely understand the argument that Mike makes that if a game comes out being like Final Fantasy, where it's like this one actually complete game versus something like the first Battlefront game where there was literally like nothing there.
It was a blank disc.
But it was still $60, and then you still had to pay more for actual content. So it's like, I definitely hate, like, I didn't buy Battlefront because I noticed that there was literally nothing there. But if they only made it like $20, I probably would have bought it because I am a big Star Wars fan. Battlefront 2 was like one of my favorite games of all time. I love that game. I still play that game. And like, I would have liked to see it in like a HD kind of version of it, but because they did charge that $60 on top of all those microtransactions, I was super turned off by that idea. Mm-hmm. And then, because like, if I was into Final Fantasy, I would always be like, oh, I know that this is going to be a great game and these $60 is actually going to go somewhere.
Yeah.
But so I guess if you already have the fan base, I don't think the sales would decline too terribly because they know what they should be expecting out of this game versus something like the Battlefront where you're like, there's nothing really there, so I get why this is so much less than, you know, the Final Fantasy, just because content-wise there's a lot less.
Yeah. Well,
but
I can
then again, I'm a much more rational consumer than a lot of other people, so who knows?
You don't just see Star Wars and buy it immediately, which is what people
Shake
did.
Pat.
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying like when you see parents buying stuff for their kids or whatnot, they just see, oh, this says Star Wars, let's get it.
True.
Talk about that.
That's super true. Yeah.
Yeah. So in my mind, I feel like, I guess to kind of wrap this up and whatnot, I feel like so many, at least this is from what I see, and I want to see if you guys agree, from when it comes to indie versus AAA games, I feel like indie games are more what they're making their games feel like. It's feel like games that we grew up playing. Like when it comes down to games, maybe if it's like, would you consider Hat in Time indie or AAA? I don't know.
It's
I
indie
feel like it's more,
for sure.
Yeah. So games like Hat in Time would probably remind us of maybe like a Donkey Kong 64 kind of game. And they kind of are more fit for kind of our kind of audience. And because of that, we're going more of the route because we're getting the experience that we want through these kind of indie games. And it seems like AAA games are going kind of down the mobile route, at least when it comes to the way that they're actually making money off of their games. They're not getting it off that $60 price tag anymore, which is why I was curious about what you thought about that. But I'm with you, Mike. It is a double-edged sword. We would definitely see a lot of other side effects from it. So I'm wondering if it's going to keep going down the mobile route, or if there's going to be some AAA developers actually making the switch, basically saying, no, we're going to keep making these single player experiences so people will still be able to have beautiful games like this with a lot of depth to it, but that aren't trying to nickel and dime you every single time that you get it. Mm-hmm. So in my mind, I'm hoping that the mobile kind of market stays out of console games, but I think it's here to stay.
Yeah, at least for these types of games, I don't see it disappearing, at least completely. Yeah, I think the only thing you can hope is that it doesn't worsen, you know?
Yeah,
but we'll see.
I guess that's true. So I've said basically what I want to say. So what about you guys?
Yeah, I think I pretty much said how I feel on the topic.
Travis?
I think the points we made were sufficient.
All right, sounds good. Well, there's a comment section below. Leave a comment for us. We really want to hear your thoughts on it whatsoever, whether you prefer AAA or indie games, or whether you might see yourself going the route of more of an indie game or AAA games, depending on what kind of gamer you are. Let us know. Otherwise, if you also have topics for us, we'd love to hear those as well. So, signing off. Bye-bye.
Adios.
Bye.